already know some of you, but for those who don't, I am Natalie Doyle, and I am this semester acting director of the Monash European and EU Centre, because the permanent director, Professor Vino, is on research leave. And as acting director of the Monash European and EU Centre, it's my great pleasure to welcome an international visitor who is giving his first public lecture for us. And that is Daniel Nauren, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and is Director of a similar centre to ours, the Centre for European Research at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Now, he's also been a Marie Curie Fellow, a very prestigious position at the European University Institute, a visiting researcher at the European Institute of Sussex University, and at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And if you had a flyer, you will have seen there's more information on Daniel, but I do not want to steal away from his speaking time. So I will stop here. Daniel will, in fact, try to give us an answer to this question, which I think has been on everybody's mind, especially since the onset of the crisis of sovereign debt in Europe, which is who governs Europe. Certainly, if you see it from Australia and if you see the latest report, you think, oh, Angela Merkel. But obviously, there's much more to it than that, right? And Daniel is obviously going to present that. So, could you please join me in welcoming our guest? Hand over to him, and please press the on button.
Yes, I'm ready.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And thank you everyone for coming to this lecture. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to talk to you on this topic, who governs Europe. Simple question deserves a simple answer. Who governs Europe? The simple answer is no one. Europe doesn't have a government. Europe is not a state, it's a continent. It's composed of around 50 states, depending on where you draw the line, more than 500 million people. A majority of these people today are citizens of their own states, but also citizens now of the European Union. So what if we reframe the question to who governs the European Union? Well, the answer would still be no one. There is no single actor or entity that governs the European Union. There's no group of oligarchs that leads the European Union. The European Union is a political system where power is shared between different actors, between supranational, national, sometimes even subnational actors, between public and private actors. It's shared formally and informally. It's a complex political system. That's why you need university classes to understand it. That's good for people like me, otherwise we would be out of work if we could just simply point at who governs this system. And because it's complex, I also have a second, more complex title to this lecture. Power and Legitimacy in the Post-Lisbon European Union. So power is shared rather than concentrated. That doesn't mean it's equally distributed. Okay? So some are more powerful than others in this system. And power relations also change over time. They change as a result of treaty changes governing the European Union formally, legally. It changes because of economic changes or changes to the membership of the European Union, etc. And so in this lecture now, I will point at some aspects of the distribution of power in the European Union and some of the changes that have taken place in the last decade or so. And I will focus on three themes. power of the EU institutions, that is the European Commission, European Parliament, Council of Ministers, European Council. And I will assume through the lecture now that you'll have at least a basic understanding of what these institutions are. Second theme, the power of the member states, and that is more specifically the distribution of power between the member states in the Council of Ministers and in the European Council, which are the member state governments' institution in the EU system. And finally, I will say a few words also on the power of civil society or private actors, or lobbyists, as they're called in the newspapers. And I only have about 40 minutes or so, and these are big questions. So obviously this will be a bit general, but I'll give you a few points and also show you some recent research that I have done myself and that others have done that says something about this. Okay, so starting with the power of the EU institutions and the distribution of power between the EU institutions. We can point at two trends here in recent years. We've seen, on the one hand, a strengthening of the European Council, and on the other hand, a strengthening of the European Parliament, at the cost of the European Commission and the Council of Ministers. These are two trends, two parallel trends that have been going on for 10, 15 years. Now, quick repetition. The Commission, of course, is the agenda setter in the legislative process. It's the civil servants institutions, the bureaucrats institutions in the system, proposing legislation. The Council of Ministers and the European Parliament are the two legislative institutions deciding on the legislative proposals. Council of Ministers composed of ministers from the member state governments, environmental ministers, agricultural ministers, etc. European Parliament, directly elected every 50 years by European citizens. And the European Council is the institution for the EU leaders, if you read the newspapers, the prime ministers, the heads of states. This is where Angela Merkel and Sarkozy and David Cameron and the others meet, the European Council. And this forum, the European Council, has gained increasing weight in the EU system over the years. It was originally created in the 1970s as a sort of very informal discussion club between the prime ministers, but it has developed and become more and more institutionalized, and is now a decision-making machinery which takes perhaps most of the most important decisions in the system. It has, according to the treaties, the executive function of pointing out the long-term direction of the European Union, giving leadership in big questions such as treaty changes, accession of new members. It also coordinates the most important foreign policy issues, economic policy issues. It appoints important positions within the European system, appoints the President of the Commission, for example. And it has increasingly been taking over issues from the ministers in the Council of Ministers, the most important, most controversial issues. Nowadays, the Council of Ministers is often viewed as too junior to deal with those issues, and so they're pushed up to the Prime Minister level. In the Lisbon Treaty, the most recent treaty change, the European Council also had a more centralized, institutionalized presidency, the permanent instead of a rotating presidency, which it had before. And this has also led to more of higher ambition in the European Council, more meetings, more decisions. And the European Council also had another important task, which makes it a heavy institution in the system, namely that it is the main crisis manager in the EU system. And since the EU is always in some sort of crisis, the European Council has a lot to do. So this is one trend. The power of the prime ministers and the prime ministers' offices and the governments of the United States has strengthened with the European Council becoming more important. The second winner in the last decades is clearly the European Parliament. Through successive treaty changes over the last 15-20 years, the Parliament has gained increasing competences and is now on equal footing with the Council of Ministers in most legislative issues. In the Lisbon Treaty, again, the most recent treaty change, the Parliament again had more power over more policy areas. Now, for example, agriculture, asylum, immigration policies, more powers over international treaties, etc. So there's been a continuous raise in power of the European Parliament over the years. And again, at the cost of the Council of Ministers, that used to be the main legislative body who had to listen to the Parliament but not always take into account the positions of the Parliament. This has affected the decision-making process in the European Union in many ways. I will show you one example of what has happened during the last 10 years. And here's an additional bonus that you get to learn some Swedish also from this lecture. This figure shows a trend towards decision-making that is more informal than it used to be, because that makes it more effective. That's the main trend. So we see three different lines here in the figure. Two of them are decreasing. One of them is increasing sharply. First, läsning is increasing, while second and third läsning is decreasing. So can anyone guess what läsning means in Swedish? Readings. Okay? So in the legislative process of the European Union, you can have 1, 2, or 3 readings. That means that the proposal that the Commission gives in the first reading, that's the first time it comes to the Parliament and the Council of Ministers for decision. If they don't agree at the first reading, it will go back to the Commission, who might revise the proposal, and then it comes back again for a second reading. And they can do it again if they don't agree for a third reading. So what this figure shows here is that there's been a strong increase in trying to get the institutions together for common decision already at the first reading. And the way to do this is to go from formal procedures to more informal procedures. So what happens in practice is that the Commission puts its proposal to the Parliament and the Council, and immediately a group A small group of people from the Commission, Parliament and the Council meet informally and try to figure out, okay, so what's the situation in your institution? What type of problems may we have with this proposal? This is the situation in our institutions. Okay, how can we find an agreement here without going to second and third readings? Because that means a much longer and inefficient decision-making process. So this is one implication of the European Parliament becoming stronger, that we have more decision-making in these rather close circles of key decision-makers in the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. Summing up on the power of between the EU institutions, there's two trends here, two parallel trends. One, the Parliament is growing stronger, parliamentarization. Two, the European Council is growing stronger, the executive power of the European Council is stronger. Maybe we could call it a type of presidentialization. So what we see could be interpreted as the European Union sort of going in the direction of more of a semi-presidential system. Parliament on the one hand, and a strong presidency in the form of the European Council, like, for instance, France. Now, to the power of the member states. This is, of course, another power game that is going on within the EU system, within the Council of Ministers and the European Council. Namely, the interactions between the member state governments. And usually, these negotiations, bargaining between member states, are described as being very consensus-oriented compared to international negotiations generally. Member states try to find compromises rather than narrow majorities. And this is important for the European Union legitimacy, that the member states don't, I mean, they can be outvoted in the system, but if they are often outvoted, if there's a creation of more or less permanent minorities, that would be very difficult in terms of legitimacy for the system. So there's always a search for compromise in the interaction between the member states. But, of course, there's also a power struggle where the member states try to get as much as possible out of this compromise. And one thing that has happened here in the last years is that we've seen a trend that the big member states have become more powerful than the smaller and medium-sized member states. This is partly because of the institutional changes I talked about before, and in particular the strengthening of the European Council. Because the European Council, again, this is the forum where the prime ministers sit around the table, discuss, bargain, take decisions. That type of environment with little power for the supranational institutions, fairly informal type of bargaining situation. That type of forum is the place where the big member states can really play out their power resources. They are more constrained when it comes to the normal legislation, where the Commission is the agenda setter. They have to care about the European Parliament, etc. So a strong European Council means more power to the big member states. And we've also seen more of informal coordination between the big member states outside of the institutions. In particular, after the economic crisis, we've seen the Franco-German axis be very active. We talk about Mercosur as an actor in this crisis, coordinating the economic policies. We've seen more of that in recent years. What happens then is that we have this informal coordination between some of the big member states, which they then take to the European Council, give it to the President, Van Rompuy, and say, okay, so here's a suggestion, and then the European Council becomes more of, the other member states in the European Council have to sort of, it's not much they can do about this suggestion that comes from the big member states. So they use the European Council more to formalize the informal deals that they've made outside of the institutions. We've seen more of that. Another thing that is coming when the Lisbon Treaty new voting rules take effect is that we'll see more formal voting power also given to the bigger member states. This is something they achieved in the bargain on the Lisbon Treaty. Big member states will have more formal voting power after the new rules come into effect, which is in 2014. I'm not sure if you can see that over there, but so this is a power index that you can create on the basis of the voting rules that exist now in the Council of Ministers. And what the Lisbon Treaty did was that it strengthened the weight of population size in the voting rules. So states with larger population size now have more voting power than they used to have. This is the voting power after the Lisbon Treaty. This is the voting power they had before the Lisbon Treaty. And as you can see, Germany, France, UK, Italy at the top had a much larger share of the formal voting power in the Lisbon Treaty compared to what they had in the Nice Treaty. While almost all the other member states, they have the red diamond to the left of the blue dot, meaning they have less formal voting power after the Lisbon Treaty. So the big member states have sort of strengthened their position. Let me also show you a picture based on some of the research that I have done, which shows how they also behave differently in their negotiations in the Council of Ministers. As I said before, the Council of Ministers has usually been described as a very consensual decision-making arena. The member states try to compromise as much as possible. I have done some survey research with negotiators that sit in these committees and working groups in the Council and asked them questions on their bargaining tactics, bargaining techniques. And from that, constructed a hard bargaining index. It means that the more to the right you are in this index, the more of a tough negotiator you are. And as you can see, there's not so much variation between the member states except for three of them, namely the big three, UK, France, Germany, come out of this as much tougher bargainers. Means that if they are in a situation where they can, for instance, block a decision that they don't like, it's much more likely that they either will block the decision or demand very specific compensation for not blocking the decision than any of the other member states. So the other member states are playing much more along with the consensus norm than the big three. And here's another picture, also from the same survey data of negotiators involved in negotiations in Brussels. It shows you the network capital of the different member states in the council. Network capital means that you have easy access to cooperation partners. So this is based on questions concerning which other member states do you cooperate with often within your working groups, within your committees. And the ones that score highly here are member states that are often mentioned as cooperation partners. So these are the most popular, you can say, cooperation partners in the negotiations. I call it network capital. This is a very important power resource, to have connections with the other member states during the negotiations. If you have a strong network capital, you will be able to get information during the negotiations, you will be able to spread your own information during the negotiations, and be better able to create coalitions in the negotiations. And as you can see here, when I did this survey in 2009, the UK scored the highest, having most easily access to other member states' negotiators. But you also see that France and Germany score very highly. These three again are at the center. Most attractive cooperation partners. But then there are some other interesting aspects here as well. Some of the smaller member states are doing actually not that bad. Sometimes the smaller member states may be able to use the network capital to create coalitions and gain the negotiations. And for example, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands score fairly highly. The Swedish government loves it when I show them this graph. Yeah, we're doing really well. While if you see up in the right corner, Spain, Italy, these are big member states which don't have that much of network capital. So the size is not the only explanation for which states that score highly on network capital. One other thing that you can see from this picture is, of course, how the alliances are built between the member states and the council. If you look carefully here, you see clear geographical pattern in which member states choose to work with, who they choose to work with. So, I mean, to the left, you have Northern European member states, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. To the right, Eastern European member states, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland. In between North and East, the Baltic states. Up to the right, Mediterranean, some European states. It's almost a map of Europe. It's just based on the question, who do you most often cooperate with? So, I would say the big three member states, UK, Germany, France, they do stand out in many respects when we study what is going on in the Council of Ministers and in the European Council. They have strengthened their voting power. They score very highly in terms of network capital. They have a different type of bargaining behavior, much tougher negotiators than the others. So does that mean that we have sort of an oligarchy, after all, in the Council? There is some mixed evidence here, because there are also other interesting studies that show that even though they might have even though they might be the most central and powerful actors here, it's not automatically so that they get what they want in the negotiations. There are studies by, for example, Robert Thompson at Trinity College Dublin, who have studied the bargaining success of the member states in the Council, which is looking at the initial positions of member states and a large number of issues, and then looking at the actual outcome. Okay, so did they achieve what they wanted in the negotiations? That type of study does not show a clear picture that the big member states are more successful than the smaller, medium-sized member states. And one explanation for that is that the big three often don't agree on what to do on the different legislative proposals, so they will end up in different coalitions. This is something which is, of course, important and good for the smaller and medium-sized member states. It's seldom that the big member states actually have common preferences. So, I will also say a few words about the power of the lobbyists. This is a group of actors which is less visible. Interest groups, private interest groups. Sometimes described, if you read the newspapers, as the real power holders in the European Union. I think they are important, but they're not that important, as you may think when you read the papers. I think that the lobbyists, the research shows that the lobbyists are to a large extent trapped by the conditions that are set by the political institutions in the EU. So this picture shows the development over time of the number of interest groups that are based in Brussels. The dotted line shows the cumulative increase in number of interest groups in Brussels. The more varying line there shows the increase per year. And now again we get to learn some Swedish. You see there are two big tops here at that line. One is at Romfördraget, Treaty of Rome. The other is Maastricht-Fördraget, Treaty of Maastricht. So what this picture shows is that in times when the European Union is delegated more power by the member states, immediately after that, more interest groups, more lobbyists go to Brussels and establish offices in Brussels. It happened after the Rome Treaty, it happened after the Maastricht Treaty. And there's a saying that lobbyists shoot where the ducks are. So they go where the power is. And this is an illustration of that. The more political power that is delegated to the European Union, the more lobbyists go to Brussels. There are some estimations now that there is around 15,000 or so lobbyists in Brussels. This is a very uncertain estimation, but there are a lot of lobbyists in Brussels. These lobbyists mostly represent business interests. We lack reliable figures here, but estimations usually say around 70% or something like that of the lobbyists active in Brussels represent some type of business interest. So the remaining 30% would be lobbyists representing NGOs, trade unions, also regional organizations, professional associations like the Doctors Association, etc. But most lobbyists are there to represent business interests. And this, of course, is not unique for the European Union. We find the same pattern in states in the US and probably in Australia as well. How much power do these lobbyists have? There's an interesting study done by Christine Mahoney, which I refer to here, who compared lobbying in the European Union and the United States. So she looked at more than 80 different lobby organizations in the EU and over 100 in the United States and compared their lobbying behavior and their lobbying success. One of the things that she found was that it's rare that lobbyists are completely successful, that they get all what they want. The European Union, the red column, about 17% of the lobbyists she studied actually got out of the decision-making process what they pushed for, their position. Most lobbyists in the EU get some of what they want, partly successful. And here's also an interesting difference between Europe and the United States. You see that in the United States, more interest groups get all of what they want compared to in Europe. More interest groups get nothing of what they want. It's more winners and losers in the US system. While in Europe, the most common outcome is that you get something. And this is again a reflection of the compromise culture, the consensus culture that exists in the EU political system. Policy outcomes are most often compromises between different interests. And the lobbyists have to adjust to that. They also have to compromise. This is why they usually get at least something, but not everything from what they want. And that they do have a different strategy than the US lobbyist is also shown in this picture. So this is the lobbyist goals. What type of goals do the lobbyists have when they go and try to influence the decision-making process? In the United States, it's more common than in Europe that they go to try to block the proposal, to get rid of the proposal completely from the agenda. It's also more common that they try to initiate their own proposal, come up with a different proposal. While the most common lobbying goal among the EU lobbyists is to try to modify a proposal which is already there on the agenda. So again, the type of compromised behavior. The Commission has put forward this proposal. We don't like it, but we know that we can't get all of what we want here, so we need to see how can we modify this proposal to make it at least better for us than it is right now. So lobbyists are moderately successful in the European Union, you can say. And as all other actors in the system with whom they share power, because this is what we see here, they have to compromise. Summing up. So, Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State, asked 40 years ago, okay, so if I want to talk to Europe, who should I call? And even though the European Union has deepened its cooperation tremendously since then, the answer is still that there's really no one person to call. There's not one concentrated power center governing the European Union. And hopefully, in my view, there never will be. Hopefully, because in my view, what Europe needs is not so much more leadership in any simple business-like type. But what Europe needs is stable, democratic political system. And democracy in the European Union will always mean taking into account that we have so many different nationalities, so many different cultures, so many different traditions, ideas, norms, interests, etc. So that what comes out of the European Union in terms of policy must be, should be, a compromise between these different interests and ideas. I think that integrating the states of Europe was a fantastic idea. It's been a tremendous success, a unique, peaceful, powerful coordination of states. And my sort of general worry for the European Union is not that it lacks leadership of this coordination, but rather, at least potentially, a bigger problem would be if we had too much leadership that is not legitimate around the different member states in Europe. We're not there now. This is what my lecturer has shown. There's still not one power center leading. But I think that the Euro crisis now has shown a little bit what we don't want to end up with, which might be a consequence of strengthening leadership too much. For example, the tensions between Germans and the Greek now, where the Greek think that Germany sort of run their country. The Germans think they have to pay for Greeks' bad behavior, etc. That type of national tensions may come out of a system where power is not shared in a way that is perceived as legitimate. And we've also seen, as you know, the rise of populist right-wing parties in a number of European states that are playing on this nationalist card. And they will be the winners if people get the impression that they are run by others. Right? So it's important that power remains dispersed and shared in the EU, even though then it means, I mean, there is a dilemma here, of course, because it means for external relations of the European Union with Asia, United States, Africa, etc., that the European Union will always be a complicated actor to deal with, because there's not this person to